Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. The name of this session is In-Place Records Management in Microsoft 365 Strategies for Success. In this session, we'll review the strategies that you can develop to safeguard and manage your records while gaining an understanding of key mechanisms at work within Microsoft 365. There will be periods where we'll stop to address questions from the audience, but please feel free to put them in the comments beforehand. Our speaker for this session is Peter Rohalski. Peter is a senior Microsoft 365 information governance architect at Infotection North America. His expertise spans many aspects of technology management, data warehousing, business intelligence, and enterprise applications. At Infotection, his work focuses on helping clients to build their approach to implementing information governance, records management, and e-discovery compliance within Microsoft 365. He works with Infotection customers to design strategies for implementing automated governance models and assisting them in taking advantage of advanced features within Microsoft 365. And with that, I'll hand the baton off to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everybody. As Matt mentioned, we're going to be talking about records management within Microsoft 365, and we're going to be covering the basic steps that every organization should be following in order to be able to build out a retention strategy that allows them the flexibility to work and also to manage the records that they're creating within the Microsoft tenant. So just an introduction, again, Matt already kind of introduced me, but I've been with Infotection for the past year and a half. Before that, I've worked in industry and worked specifically in Microsoft 365 since about 2013. Our company is a multinational company, and we specialize specifically in Microsoft 365 and Purview technologies. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk a little bit about the pervasiveness and growth of M365, and that is likely why everybody has come to this spot, is that they're wanting to understand what they can do within records management, within the vast range of features that are available within Microsoft 365. We'll then go on to talking about how do we agree about where records should be stored. And again, there are multiple places where you can store content. We're going to talk about what's possible and where we prefer records to be stored from a records management perspective. Then we'll go on to an agreement about how long to keep things, and we're going to talk generally and then specifically. We'll talk about retention labeling and how to plan for that. We'll talk about preservation within Microsoft 365. We'll talk about how we actually delete content out of 365. And then we'll cover e-discovery, because much of what you're doing in Microsoft 365 when it comes to retention is going to impact your ability to have efficient e-discovery throughout the tenant. Now, there's a lot to cover in Microsoft 365, and that's why we recommend, whether you decide to work with us or another partner, that you connect with partners in order to accelerate the process of being able to implement all of these tools. And while we're talking about Microsoft 365 specifically in terms of retention and what's called data lifecycle management, there is much beyond that partners can help you with. And learning all of this on your own will take years, trust me. It's taken me years to learn it all. And there's a growing community of implementation partners you can choose from. So it doesn't just have to be one of us, but I will say one reason to choose Infotection is because we consider ourselves leaders in this market space. We have a lot of experience. We have a lot of direct work that we've done with Microsoft on designing a lot of the features. And so there's numerous reasons why we think that we're one of the best choices that you can make in this area. So let's move on to talking about Microsoft 365. So how did we get here? You know, is the first thing. And I kind of go back to this and talk about Microsoft 365 largely because many people who are using Microsoft 365 have started using Microsoft 365 in the last 3 to 4 years. And a large part of that was driven by the pandemic. And as you can see by the statistics here, Microsoft 365 as a platform has grown considerably over the last 4 years. Um, it started out being in third place when it came to collaboration platforms back in 2018, 2019. By 2020, it was challenging Google as the dominant platform. And in corporate America right now, it is probably the dominant platform for collaboration. And as an extension, when it comes to non-structured content, it is the dominant place where people are storing non-structured content in the corporate world. Again, it was behind tools like G Suite and Slack back in 2018. With the introduction of Teams, that has become um, largely used in corporate America. Microsoft statistics said that last year there were 270 million daily users of Microsoft Teams. And so you see it's grown to a large part of the Fortune 500. When it comes to Azure, that's actually the cloud platform that Microsoft 365 sits on. And by 2020, this rose to about 90%. So right now, 96% of the Fortune 500 use Microsoft Cloud's platforms. Over 70% of the Fortune 500 licenses Microsoft 365 for their workers. There's over 1 million companies using Microsoft 365 worldwide, and there's approximately 150,000 in the US. Again, it's a little bit higher now. It's over 280 million daily active users in Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams, and that represents a 1,000% increase since the start of the pandemic. Now, a big part of what's happening in corporate America nowadays is that information volumes are growing incredibly fast. And you can see by this chart that um, back in 2020, um, um, the total volume of content was about 47 zettabytes, which is a billion terabytes. That's forecasted to grow to about 175 million, so a fourfold increase in just the 5 years that we're right in the middle of right now. And then it's forecasted to grow another 4 times by 2030. So the volumes of data that you're dealing with are going to continue to grow year over year going forward. And that's one of the reasons why retention management and data lifecycle practices are so important in the context of working within Microsoft 365. Okay, before we move on to the next topic, does anybody have any questions so far?
Hi, Pete. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If any folks have questions or
Okay,
comments, you can refresh your browser really quick, and maybe if you're having any issues with that.
awesome. Okay, so why do we want to have information governance and records management? Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that information is easy to access, that we're not keeping information around longer than we need to, and that we can discard information that's no longer relevant to your organization. So we talk about that in a couple different ways. Within teams, we want to make it so that people can find information quickly. Um, and and in the case of discovery, we want to ease the ability to discover content for legal purposes. Um, we generally want people to be able to find the relevant information that they need to use on a daily basis. And one of the ways that we can do this is by discarding content that's no longer needed, and that reduces the amount of content that would come back to any particular user in the context of a search. We want also for people to be able to trust the information that they're using, and um, we can do that within Microsoft 365s because Microsoft 365 and the tools that are used there span all of the workloads that are in Microsoft 365. So you don't have to have different solutions in place in order to manage your content within 365 because the tools that Microsoft provides you gives you the ability to manage content wherever it sits within your tenant. Now, you'll notice that we're indicating on this particular slide, and I'm not going to go through all of the details on this slide, but you'll see that in some cases, what we're doing is we're indicating that you either need an E3 license or an E5 license, and we'll talk a little bit about E5 licensing because it's not per se a specific E3 or E5 license, or I should say E5 license, but Microsoft has what's called a step-up program where you can actually get E5 features incrementally as your practices grow and as you expand your use of the platform as a whole. And on that, we're going to move forward to a survey. And this survey, you can go to menti.com and fill it in. There's also, I think Matt's going to share a link in the chat that you can just click on to get to this survey. But the first thing I want to ask everybody is, what licensing does your company currently have? Do you have E3 licensing? Do you have an E5 add-on, which there are a number of them? Or do you have full E5, or don't you know at this point? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to answer that poll, and then we'll take a look at what the results are. Okay, so one person answered that they are, so we've got one person, okay, so we've got 2 responses so far. I'm going to give you a few, let's say 15 more seconds to answer, and then we'll show you the results. Okay.
Hey,
Okay,
Pete. So it looks
so we've
like we're
got
getting
5 people so far, and I am sharing it. Can everybody see the results? Because they're not coming through on my screen. Okay, well, I'll go through and just review them. So we have one person with an E3 license. We have 2 people who responded that they have E5, and then 3 people who don't know. And I think the point of having this survey is it's important for you to understand what licensing you do have and what your licensing options are, because those will affect what features you can or cannot use within Microsoft 365 and what features you need to be managing in order to make sure that you're compliant with your licensing agreement. Oh,
Hey, Pete, do you need me to put the other slides back up? Sorry, folks. It looks like we're
oh
having some
God.
technical difficulties.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. I'm going to turn out, I left my camera off because I'm not sure if that had any impact on what happened. Um, so let's go on to the design decisions that we typically recommend people look at. Okay, so again, what we're talking about is in-place records, in-place retention and records management. And what that means is that we recommend that people, rather than relocating content, and there are some exceptions to this that we'll actually talk about, but when it comes to where you store documents, we recommend in-place retention and records management, which means that you're not going to move content in order for it to be um, managed from a retention perspective. The main reason for this is because by moving content, you present some challenges to people in terms of finding content. And so keeping content where people work on the content. And a lot of times what we're talking about in Microsoft 365 is active content, which means it's being revised over time. So moving content even once it's been declared as a record, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, is something that we generally recommend against. Now, when we talk about the workloads within Microsoft 365, we also recommend that people have a defined retention period or default retention for everything in those workloads. So SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, um, Outlook, which really is the client, it's Microsoft Exchange, and Yammer should all have default periods where you're keeping content and you're saying basically after this period of time, we are going to delete content once it's older than, let's say, 3 years. And you have the ability to define retention for each of these workloads individually. And within teams, you can even specify different retention periods for your documents and for your messaging and for what's individual messaging and group messaging. Okay. The third recommendation that we make is that all items within OneDrive and Outlook that qualify as records must be moved to SharePoint or Teams. And the reason for that is that by default, those workloads are private workloads, which means that by default, nobody can see the content. So if I declare a record in a private space, I then have the problem that nobody else in the organization can see that content and inspect that record, except from an administrative perspective. So we generally recommend that people be moving stuff out of those private workloads when they want to declare them as records. And we'll cover this a little bit later. We also recommend that we don't even deal with records or content as a record in those locations in many cases. We also propose for most of our clients to use metadata as a way of automating record management, which means that I can actually assign a classification to content using metadata, and then I can have an automated mechanism for applying a retention policy to that content via what's called a retention label. And then in addition to that, what we also recommend people do is be able to declare records based on another piece of metadata, which basically is changing a document from a draft status to a final status. And then finally, the classification, whatever you're using to classify your documents, you should have a means whereby you can transfer that classification into Microsoft 365. And for that purpose, we offer a connector that is available for um, some third-party applications that allow you that basically assist in building your file plan. But there's also a way of importing your classification information directly into Microsoft 365. It's a little bit more cumbersome. It doesn't have nearly the same kinds of features, but as a starting point, you can use that. So for records or for documents within your environment, there's a few different ways that you can actually define your retention periods. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but um, uh, what we generally focus on is that there's multiple ways of starting the retention period. Some of these require additional licensing. Some of them can be used out of the with your base licensing that most of you would have. Um, one of the things that's common in a lot of record schedules is you'll see that uh, record schedules can tend to use what are called events as a way of defining when retention starts. And while event-based records management can be done within Microsoft 365, it's a much more complex process because what you end up getting into is the problem of how do you signal when the event has occurred um, um, so that the clock can be started. The other things that, and this is a relatively new feature that's just coming to bear, but there's also what's called case-based retention. And that's something that Microsoft is not yet publicly, it's not generally available, but it is in preview right now. A few things that we also talk about, and that is because of the fact that Microsoft 365 has evolved over a period of close to 10 years, um, uh, some of the mechanisms that you might have been able to use in Microsoft 365 are no longer recommended. So our general guidance to clients is that they should be using purview policies whenever possible in their records management and retention management strategies, which means that we want you to avoid using SharePoint information management policies, um, SharePoint record centers, Exchange MRM policies, and Exchange litigation holds. And at this point, Microsoft's already basically disabled the ability to create litigation holds using Microsoft Exchange. This is how people used to be able to do mailbox holds in the past. It's been deprecated. They still can exist, but the only thing you can do now is to see the holds and remove them. And what we recommend that people do is they transition to purview data lifecycle retention policies, which are the general policies, purview retention labels, and then using either standard holds that are available in Purview, or using custodial holds, which are available in E5 and E5 add-on licenses. Okay, so this slide is an informational slide that we put together, and it really is when we talk about where content is stored. You may think about an area like Exchange email, um, um, and think that content is stored in Microsoft Exchange, and you would be correct. But in some of the other workloads, what you'll find is um, um, it breaks down into, if I'm looking at a document and I want to know where it's stored, it is going to be stored in either SharePoint or OneDrive. If I'm looking at a message, whether that is an email, whether that's chat, or whether that is dialogue that happens in Yammer, that is all stored in Microsoft Exchange. And so there really are only two places that content is stored nowadays in Microsoft 365. There are some areas that are not accessible to Purview, but that where Microsoft is still using Azure Cloud Storage, but Microsoft is moving all of that content into one of these two workloads. And an example of that is what Microsoft did over the past couple of years with Microsoft Stream. Microsoft Stream used to have its own Azure storage. Now Microsoft Stream videos are always stored in either SharePoint or OneDrive, depending on how they're created. When we talk about Microsoft Teams, that is also true. Your content when you're working in Microsoft Teams is stored in either OneDrive or SharePoint. When you talk about documents, it is stored in Exchange Online when you're talking about one-to-one chat or group conversations. And so it's important to understand that because your policies are the execution of your policies will be based on which platform, which workload the content's actually being stored in. And we'll cover this a little bit later. One thing to note on this is that you'll see that we have meeting recordings here. And meeting recordings are a feature of Microsoft Teams meetings. Your meeting recordings will be stored in either OneDrive or SharePoint, depending on how you schedule your meetings. And for most people, they schedule meetings through the Exchange. They schedule meetings through Microsoft Outlook. And so when you schedule a meeting on Microsoft Outlook, the meeting recording is always stored in the OneDrive account of the person who starts the recording. And then that meeting recording is shared out to everybody else who is participating in the meeting. For channel meetings, you can schedule those to occur in a channel, and as a result, those meeting recordings get stored in the SharePoint site that's associated to the team. And I think we have a spot here for questions. Okay, so before we move on to this topic, are there any questions?
So it looks like we had a question from Liz. Liz, can you put in the chat what it is that you want an example of? Can wait for that.
Sure.
And then we also had this comment from Sarah about the Microsoft 365 regarding the poll earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here's from Liz. Oh, it's a full
So
thing.
Liz was asking about record class assignment. So yes, what we generally use in SharePoint is we generally recommend clients use what are called content types, and that they have an enterprise content type that basically creates enterprise level metadata. One of those fields would be an information type, which corresponds generally to something in your record schedule. So, but it's basically, what do I call this particular kind of document? What kind of information is it? And it's something that allows you to basically say, for this particular set of information types, I'm going to assign them to a particular schedule in my file plan. And as a result, we can actually automate the assignment of the retention categories for that content. Now, that's used in conjunction with that information status in order to time when the retention label might be applied. Any more questions?
See. Oh, that might be an issue from on his end. I'm not seeing any more questions other than Liz's question.
Okay, good. Okay. I got to pick up the pace here. So here's basically our 4 rules when we come to building out a lifecycle management. And when we talk about lifecycle management, what we're talking about is the idea that everything in your environment should have a timer on how long it's kept. So the first thing we want to do is we want to talk about collaborative spaces. And generally, like I said, collaborative spaces are where we want to have records being stored, where we want to have content stored for long-term purposes. And so for emails that might be shared mailboxes, for files, it's going to be a SharePoint site, whether or not that site is associated to a team. Okay. And remember that Microsoft Teams has a SharePoint site that sits underneath it that's associated to the group that that defines the team membership. So any information that's valuable to the organization, okay, either because it's going to become a record or because it's important knowledge to the organization, should be managed in a collaborative space. And so people need to be trained that um, we generally recommend that people are basically trained to understand the importance of collaborative spaces and the importance of sharing content in collaborative spaces as a way of doing that. Now, the other thing about this that we also talk about is we want to have consistent user experiences. So the way that we identify our retention rules, that we want them to be consistent. And so retention policies should generally apply across an entire workload. And then you might deal with exceptions to those policies through a secondary policy. And we can talk a little bit about how that might occur if we have time. But we want to have a general way of applying them. We want to be able to set things like container defaults if there's going to be exceptions. Um, and then we want to have security controls to manage changes to the retention rules. So when we talk about data lifecycle management, there usually is not a way around the lifecycle process that we build into Microsoft 365, except by using labeling. Retention on all information, again, it's important that you maintain control over how long you keep content everywhere within Microsoft 365. And we generally recommend that personal spaces and private spaces have shorter retention periods than collaborative spaces, because that encourages people to move content into collaborative areas. And by doing that, it gives you more options for automation. And it also gives that content more visibility to the organization, and so increases the value of the content in the long term. And then finally, we want to have a governance structure that actually deals with that content and can, for example, um, uh, define exactly how we're going to differentiate content within any particular area. So our governance processes, we want to be able to support lifecycle management. We want to support information ownership and the delegation of management of content throughout the business. And then we also want to be able to support information reclassification and declassification. And that has to deal with things like privacy concerns. Now, what's the impact of this? This is an example from one of our clients where they actually implemented governance policies across all of their workloads. And what you can see here is when they actually turned on retention in these workloads, you'll see a marked decline in the total volume of content that they had. And then what you also see, if you look at these closely, is that in most cases, um, the trend of growth also slowed. Specifically in email, it did, because email tends to be more of a steady state in terms of how much content is going into the environment. And so by having policies in place, you basically limit the growth of email and you get pretty much a steady state. But even in SharePoint, you'll see that there was a drop off and somewhat of a lessening of a trend of growth. And that's, again, this plays out in terms of people being able to find content. It also plays out in terms of being able to use that content for discovery purposes in your legal processes. I'm going to skip over questions because we're a little behind on time and I want to make sure we get up through all of this content. So we'll have about 10 minutes at the end of this for questions for everybody. So I'm going to move forward. Okay, so labeling. The main purpose of labeling is to allow you to have fine-grained control over how long individual items are kept. And one of the things that we want to talk about when it comes to labeling is we want to talk about the difference between records and non-records. And you can use labeling for both purposes, but declaring something a record adds certain protections to that content. So by having a record label, you can actually lock and protect information as of when it was labeled. That will always be available regardless of what happens to the content afterwards. It is then a single source of truth about that particular piece of content. You can make copies of it, but those won't be the records. Um, uh, and you also have some limitations in terms of where you can move that content afterwards. Again, we're applying a retention schedule to that content, and we're ensuring that that content is disposed of in whatever mechanism, in whatever way that we define that we want to have it done. When it comes to non-records, again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically reduce our storage. We're trying to reduce how much we get back in return on a search. We're also reducing legal investigation costs. And think about it this way: if we return 25% back from 25% less back from any particular search, then we've reduced 25%. We've reduced our legal investigation costs probably by about 25% because we have that many fewer documents that actually have to be reviewed. And again, there's other benefits to this. It gives you, less incidences of phishing because there's, less content that you're actually seeing. It provides people with an incentive, again, to classify records and to change the status of documents from non-records to records. Now, this is an example of this is kind of a way that we look at file plans, and this is what you'll see in Microsoft 365. And everything that's indicated in green is a feature of a file plan that is um, part of E5 or an E5 add-on license. Okay, so on the left, we have what are the things that we can do with content. You can retain things and do nothing afterwards. I can retain things and then delete them. And then I can also just delete something at the end. And the difference between these two is basically by saying delete only, you're not preventing um, individual users from deleting content, and you're not protecting that content during during the period that it before deletion. Um, so once you delete something with the delete only label on it, it will be gone within. It won't be recoverable after a couple months, generally speaking. Now, there's new features that are coming on board, and these again are E5 features. One of them is the idea of changing a label. So what I can do with retention labels is I can say I want to start out with a non-record label, which may say um, retain only. Okay, and then at the end of it, and at the end of that retention period, and let's say that's a short period, I could then change the label to a record label and then say I want to retain that for the next 7 years. That's one of the things that's possible by being able to change labels. The other thing that showed up recently is something called is basically being able to invoke a workflow and build workflows that actually have a more complex disposal process tied to them. Maybe it has a different kind of approval process or review process that's not possible in the basic features that you get out of 365. Over on the right-hand side here, you'll see that I think we talked about events, and this is one way for you to be able to trigger retention periods. But this is again an E5 feature. There's also dispositions of content, and generally speaking, if you're using an E3 license, your only option for disposing of content is one of these deletion options for the label that says basically deleted at the end of a specific period, whether or not it's being retained. Manual retention or manual disposition here, we're talking about a disposition review, and that can be up to 5 different stages, where you could have somebody who does a review at a very detailed level and then push it up somewhere else in the organization where they do a more summary review of the content. Again, we have records. You can declare something as a record. There's something called a regulatory record, which has a lot more restrictions on it. And I think we have a diagram that's going to show that a little bit later. And then you also have the option to start a record label unlocked when it's applied. And this is used for auto apply processes, which we'll talk about in a minute. Again, the descriptors down below allow you to basically have more information about where your labeling might apply. You can do things like you can say what legal you can cite basically the law that requires a particular retention label to be used. You can categorize it within the business. This reference over here can be used, for example, if you use file plan descriptors. And those are all E5 features also. Okay, so again, retention policies are going to be general policies that apply to containers. Retention labels allow you to apply policies that apply to specific content. And again, there's 2 different ways to do this. We'll talk about this in a minute. I talked about the idea of retention labels, and this chart basically shows you that depending on the kind of label that you're using, you further are restricting the use of content. So for example, a normal retention label still allows people to edit the content of that document. Um, um, and in many cases, what that does is that just extends the retention period. But if I'm using a record label, then a record label will either start locked or unlocked. And if it's starts out, if a document's unlocked, then you can edit the content. Um, if it's locked, then you're blocked from editing the content. You actually have to go through a process whereby you unlock the content. And all of these actions, most of these actions do have restrictions once you start using retention labels. Um, the biggest one that people run into is that when it comes to moving content across containers, that becomes a little bit more problematic because uh, once you once you've actually changed the status of a record, you're no longer allowed to move that from container to container. And again, regulatory records, you'll notice that anything that alters the document is something that's blocked here. So once I use a regulatory record, the only thing I can do with that with a document or message that has a regulatory record label is to view the content. I can't edit it. I can't do anything. I can't move it. I can move it from folder to folder within a site, but I can't move it. I can't move it between locations anymore. And that's one of the reasons why we recommend that people really think hard about using regulatory record labels. Okay, now there's that we're a little bit behind schedule, and I apologize for this. There's two ways to do this. Again, publishing a policy is basically saying where labels can be used. Auto apply policies are basically being able to assign labels automatically. And we're going to jump forward. Adaptive scopes is one thing that is really useful, and we really try to have people use. Um, um, what adaptive scopes allow you to do is to automatically have the population um, of a label policy change based on the characteristics of the container that the content's in. And so for sites, users, and groups, what you can do is you can define how these policies are actually applied. Um, when it comes to uh, retent when it comes to records management, we also recommend automation as a focus, and that's one of the reasons why E5 licensing is so important, because all of this automation that you see here, whether it is creating automated policies or using machine learning tools, is going to be tied to E5 licensing in one form or another. And again, there's a few different ways to do this. There are query-based ways that you can just use keywords and characteristics of content. You can use metadata when it's available, and this is largely going to be in SharePoint and Teams. There's also what are called sensitive information types that can be used, and trainable classifiers. One-click record declaration. This is what we were talking about earlier with the idea of using a status to change or apply a record label. Okay. And this is an easy way to provide people with the ability to create labeling. Trainable classifiers is something that has to be turned on. And this is just something to be aware of. When it comes to creating trainable classifiers, you first have to enable trainable classifiers in your environment. And what this does is it actually goes out and classifies everything that exists in your environment at that point. Building a trainable classifier is time consuming and can take weeks to do. Um, and we generally recommend that these be used more for when it comes to general classifications that might apply to information protection rather than records management. Um, when it comes to automation, we recommend people start with easy things that are um, you know, going to be easy to classify and hopefully have larger volumes of content associated with them. So we want to go for quick wins first and then move on to the things that are more complicated to classify or are going to have smaller returns as we go through that. And again, there's ways to see this in your tenant. There's a Content Explorer, which will show you what's actually happening when it comes to all of the classification that can take place in your tenant. It's a good tool for being able to understand exactly where content is located in your environment also. So we recommend that you get familiar with this tool. Data classification in the Activity Explorer is largely going to be around information protection, but it also offers you insights in terms of what's happening in your tenant and how people are creating and storing content. One thing we haven't mentioned up until this point, and I'm going to stop for questions after this because we're really kind of running out of time, is Microsoft Syntax is an alternative to trainable classifiers. It is moving to more consumption-based in terms of how you actually license it, so you don't actually have to buy licensing for a lot of the syntax features anymore. But there still are certain features within Microsoft Syntax that does require licensing. It is a much more efficient classification tool than trainable classifiers. It also is much more sophisticated in terms of the content it can actually identify. And it gives you many more business features that allow you to do things after classification than you get out of the box with trainable classifiers. We talked about these a little bit earlier. One thing I want to talk about is simulation mode. This is a new feature in Microsoft 365. It is for all of these retention policies that you're building, okay? Specifically when it comes to labeling, okay? Microsoft just recently added this feature where you can basically simulate retention policies or retention labeling before you actually apply it in your tenant. And I would recommend anybody who's thinking about using retention labeling, definitely you'll want to start out by using this simulation mode. It basically allows you to see what happens when you create a policy. It allows you to then alter that policy and re-simulate it. And then finally say when you're satisfied with it, to go ahead and implement the policy and start labeling content. Okay. I don't think we're going to have time for e-discovery, but I'll include this in the deck if you want to. I'll skip forward real quickly. And Matthew, do you want to open up the floor for questions while I'm doing that?
Yeah, so we have a question from Anna. I just put it on the screen there.
So Anna, yes, if you haven't used content types, that doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot use classification tools that are built into Purview. Content types facilitate that. And largely speaking, what your goal is going to be is to try to figure out a way that you can introduce them and introduce managed metadata as part of those content types and actually assign that by default. So for example, an example of this might be I might have a business function as part of my enterprise metadata, so I can identify what parts of the business content is being created from. And I might use that as one of the criteria for assigning a particular set of labels. So for example, finance sites might actually have a finance metadata column that I then can use to say, I want to apply finance labels only to finance content. But in the absence of having content types, there are other tools that you can use. You can specify things based on the specific locations. You can use defaults on specific locations. You can even, with an E5 license, you can set labeling for example, on the folder level. So you can say everything that gets put into this particular folder gets a particular label. So there's lots of options to do it. Having content types facilitates automation. Okay, John had a question. If OneDrive's used as the document management service in a law firm, the retention clock, okay, starts with the relation managers closed in the accounting system. So this is another example of an event that triggers a retention process. And typically in OneDrive, event-based management is not possible. So what might be necessary in this case would be workflows that can move the content into a SharePoint location. And by moving the SharePoint in location, you solve two problems. You can get the content into a collaborative space where more than just the owner and the persons who the content is being shared to have access to it. And then you can also apply metadata to the content as it's moved.
Looks like that's the last question that we have.
Okay.
So if there are no more questions,
Yeah, I'm just gonna forward to one slide. If anybody wants a copy of this deck, because there is more content that we didn't have time to get to, I'm gonna put this last slide up here. I'm sorry, the way that this works. There we go. Okay. So you can reach out to myself or Mike Alsop at InfoTection if you want a copy of this slide, or if you want to talk a little bit more about your company's particular needs in this area. We're more than open to having a conversation with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter, for talking with us today. I hope everybody enjoyed this session as much as I did. And additionally, thank you to the sponsor of this session, Vitas. Please check them out on the sponsors page. So after this session, there's a Lunch and Chew Zoom meeting if you're interested in talking with your fellow attendees. Hope to see you guys there. All right. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.